Jacob, or Yaakov, is running away from the wrath of his brother Esau. Jacob had appropriated the blessings that were intended for Esau, and now Esau was threatening to kill him. But he's running away from his brother's anger, but he's going to a place of anger. His mother and father tell him that he has to go to find himself a suitable match. So he has to go to the hometown of his mother and live with his uncle Lavan, who was a very surreptitious character. So Yaakov travels from Beersheba and he goes to Kharana. Now in Hebrew, when you want to indicate to something, you put a prefix, the letter lamed. So that would have been lecharan, to Kharan. But instead, the Torah uses an alternative. Instead of putting the prefix, the le, it puts a suffix, the letter hey. So instead of reading lecharan, it reads Kharana, which is essentially the same thing. The more common usage is le, the prefix, and less common is the suffix. So the question is asked by the great Sephardic commentator known as the Or HaChaim, why does the Torah deviate from the norm, and instead of using the prefix, the common prefix, it uses the suffix, Kharana, instead of lecharan? Now normally, this type of question would not really be so significant in any other text. Sometimes the author likes to use a different form because it's more poetic, it's more a change of terms, it makes it more interesting and less boring. But in Torah, every little detail has a message, and has a message for us today, thousands of years later. The Or HaChaim, the Sephardic commentator, gives an answer. He says there's a difference between the prefix and the suffix. The difference is as follows. You can go to a place, you travel to a place, and you're in that place. So you did actually go to the place, but you're not in the place. You don't identify with the place. You're not internally involved with that place. You're just there. You go on a business trip, and then you stay in a hotel, and then you leave. So you went to that place, but you're not part of that place. When you put the suffix, the hey at the end, it implies that you went totally into that location. You're into the very bowels, the very guts of that location. But that itself needs clarification. Why would Jacob go deeply into the bowels of Kharan? You have to realize that the name Kharan itself has a negative connotation. The name Kharan means anger or wrath. This is a place that awakened God's wrath because people were not very righteous, as we can see from the behavior of Lavan. But it's more than that. Not only it's not a nice place, it's a place in which you can see God's anger, but going to Kharan, Jacob would have to be together with his uncle, which later on became his father-in-law. And that seems to be a place that you don't want to be part of. If you have to be there, you tolerate it, but you don't identify with it. So the explanation is that, on the contrary, the purpose of going into Kharan was not just to live there and hold your nose while you're doing business there because you have to get married, you have to find yourself a wife, and you have to make a living, so you have no choice. But you go there because you're going to refine, as the Kabbalists put it, the sparks of holiness. Every place, Kabbalah teaches us, has embedded sparks of holiness that are captives in those places. In order to extricate them, to liberate them, and to unleash the hidden energy that they have, you have to enter into the inner precincts. You have to dress, just like if you want to save hostages from an enemy, you have to dress up in order to deceive the enemy and thereby be able to liberate the hostage. The same thing is true in a spiritual vein. When you go into a place, you have to go into the place. It has to be a place that you are identified with. Although you never lose your original identity, you have to act as if you're part of that place, utilize the conditions of that place to do things that will elevate the place and liberate those sparks. Yes, we live in a physical, materialistic environment, but we're deceiving everyone and the environment itself, because instead of being part of it in the way that the natives are, you're using the conditions of the place in which you're in, the Kharan, the negative place, in order to elevate it, to use it in a way that you can enhance the spirituality of yourself and later on of the whole world. So that's one way of looking at it, that Jacob doesn't just go to Kharan, he goes into Kharan in order to elevate it, in order to liberate the sparks. There's another commentary that gives another explanation that really ties in with the first one. He says that if you take the word Kharan, which means wrath, anger, it's a negative word, it's very similar, almost identical, to another word in Hebrew, which is Rina. Rina means joy. Sometimes it's used in the context of singing a joyous melody, but just plain joy. Now, Rina has the letters Resh and a Nun, and so does Kharan. The only difference is the letter Hey. Rina has a Hey, Kharan has a Ches. Now, if you're familiar with Hebrew, Ches and a Hey are almost identical. The Ches has 3 lines, one horizontal line, a vertical line on the right, and a vertical line on the left. So does Rina have a Hey, which has a horizontal line on the top, a vertical line on the right, and another vertical line on the left. But there's a difference, a hairbreadth of difference. The Hey, the left leg of the Hey, doesn't touch the roof, doesn't touch the horizontal line. In the case of the Ches, or the Chet, if you use the Sephardic pronunciation, the left leg touches the roof. That means there's a hairbreadth of difference between Kharan and Rina. That even though it seems that it's negative, that it's Kharan, it's anger, it's sadness, it's suffering, it's painful, nevertheless, this will lead to Rina, this will lead to joy. As King David says, Hazorim bedima, those who sow with tears, berina yiktzara, will reap with Rina, with joy. And this is the message, that when you go into a place, when you are in Golus, in exile, and the purpose of being in exile is to refine the place. As the Talmud says, the reason that the Jewish people were sent into exile was in order to add to their numbers converts to Judaism. That's the simple, literal understanding of that text. But the question is asked, how many converts have there been in Jewish history that justify thousands of years of suffering in exile? So the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, in his work, Torah Or, and other places, says that it doesn't mean physical human beings who are converts, that too, but it means there's another kind of conversion. When you go into a place of Kharan, a place of anger, a negative place, and you transform it, that is a form of conversion, because you're taking those sparks that were part of a foreign entity and they're becoming part of your existence. They enhance your existence. They're added on to us. So that's the idea of conversion, of adding on the sparks of holiness from a place of anger into a place of holiness. So when you go to Kharan, even though it seems that it's a negative place, it's a sad place, ultimately there will be Rina, there will be rejoicing. So there's a very fine line between Kharan, the negative, and Rina. And essentially, the difference between Kharan and Rina seems to be the difference between the pessimist and the optimist. The pessimist is Kharan. Why is Kharan pessimism? Because he sees the negative. He sees the glass half empty. He sees emptiness. He sees a void. He sees a vacuum. Then there's the Rina person, the person who sees the glass half full, the optimist. But if we think a little bit more deeply into this, we have 2 questions that need to be addressed. Question number 1, I mentioned the fact that there's a hairbreadth of difference between Kharan, anger, wrath, Golus, exile, negativity, and Rina, song, joy, positivity. Only a hairbreadth of difference between them? Yes, it works that way with the hay and the ches. The ches and the hay are only different by a hairbreadth. But still, when we're dealing with reality, how could you say the glass full, the positive that we have, and the negative are only a hairbreadth of difference? Yes, it's true that through our work in Kharan, through Jacob's work in Kharan, together with his uncle Lavan and his father-in-law Lavan, he established 11 of the 12 tribes, which are the nucleus of the Jewish people that would bring Rina, song, to the world, but they're so far apart. The suffering is so far apart from the Rina, from the rejoicing. They don't exist, you would think, simultaneously. It takes a long time, a long, arduous process in exile to lead to Rina, to lead to the joy. That's question number one. Question number two, how could we look at suffering and pain so dismissively, that the pain is nothing? How does a person act optimistically to look at the glass half full, but when the truth is that the glass is also half empty? There's a lot of pain and suffering in the world. So while you're looking at the half full, you're deluding yourself, essentially, because you're ignoring the half empty. So how do we reconcile Kharan and Rina that seem to go together? But I'd like to just add a very important addition to this. In this commentary that says that Kharan and Rina go together, if you put the hay at the end of the word Kharan, Kharana, then you have the word Rina there. So that actually the Rina and the Kharan coexist in the same word. Kharan, and then the hay reads Rina. How do we put the Kharan and the Rina together? How do we put glass half full and half empty simultaneously? If you're looking at the half full, you're ignoring the half empty. If you look at the half empty, you're in pain and you don't notice the half full. That's why we have to look at things from a third perspective, not half empty or half full, not Kharan or Rina, Kharana, the combination of the two. How do we explain the combination of the two? Here's where Chassidus, the Chassidic perspective, comes into this issue. The Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, in his classic work, the Tanya, explains that pain and suffering are real. There's no question about it. When a person, God forbid, loses a close relative, they're obligated by Jewish law to grieve. As if you need an obligation, if you're human, you will grieve, you will be sad. And nowhere does it say that a person, after losing a close relative, should start singing and dancing with joyous melodies. That would be contrary to the law that requires grieving and mourning. We're not aware of that. We're not ignorant of that. Rather, we're very well aware of that. So to say that you're going to rejoice at the time when there's suffering and pain, that's not a reality. The reality is that you have to identify with pain and suffering, especially if it's someone else's pain and suffering. But the truth is, there's another dimension, a third dimension. If some people are optimists and some people are pessimists, that's because they're not looking at the third dimension. The third dimension, maybe you could say, is where the cup is all full. There's nothing empty. I would call a person like that, according to the word, a poptimist, a combination of pessimism and optimism. Well, how could that be? How could you be pessimistic and optimistic at the same time? The answer is you go deeper beneath the surface. The Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, based on a biblical verse, that suffering and pain in this world derives from a higher level of the divine. It's a hidden level of the divine. And when a person goes through suffering, they have to learn to tap into that hidden reservoir of joy. And that, although now there's also a surface level that you have to identify with, that you have to experience, the sadness, at the same time you have to know that there's something beneath the surface, that is joyous. This explains when Hillel, the great sage Hillel, was returning from a trip and he hears someone crying from pain. Hillel says, I know for sure that this is not coming from my house. And the question is asked, how did he know that it wasn't coming? It doesn't say he was a prophet, that he knew prophetically. How did he know that the screaming didn't come from his house? If you're praying, you can't pray for something that already happened. Either the screaming came from his house or it didn't. And one of the explanations to that is that Hillel was so sure that his family members would not cry out because they would see the good. How could they see the good when there's something that causes a person to cry out? Someone is very ill, someone is in pain. And the answer is he knew that his family members were able to see beneath the surface, that while they were suffering, they were able to see the hidden good, the divine concealment that in the Messianic age, the Alter Rebbe says, will be fully revealed. And those who tap into that now will experience the joy, the arena, the glass being entirely full in the future. So yes, while we do have to identify with pain and suffering, we have to know that deep down, at the very core, it's not Charan, it's Rina. So we live on these two dimensions. It's not half full or half empty. On the surface level, it's all empty. We have to feel the pain and not try to explain it away, but knowing at the same time that beneath the surface, there's something very holy, something very pure, something very true hidden, but very, very joyous. I once heard of a story of a great chassid who was extremely ill and in terrible, terrible pain. And what he would do is, when a person is in pain, of course, they groan. But then he would remind himself of what the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that pain and suffering is a revelation of a hidden aspect of God that will become revealed in the Messianic age. So he would then he would express his pleasure. So he would go from oy to ah, oy to ah. We're not perhaps at that level, but we have to always recognize that beneath the surface of the suffering and pain is something very, very positive. But it's not enough, because we want that positive to become the revealed experience, that there should be no longer surface pain, no more charan, only rina. And that's why in these last days of Golus, of exile, the Rebbe encouraged us to take the words that we have in our prayers, take them seriously, and to cry out to God, Ad Masai, how much longer do we have to be in exile? And that should be followed by a joyous expression of faith that Mashiach's coming is imminent. So we go from oy to ah, oy to ah. And when we show that we're not happy with Golus, we're not happy with a Charan, and we want the Rina exclusively, that itself hastens the redemption and will bring the world to a state of perpetual joy, perpetual Rina.